Welcome to Philbits, where we explore specific themes, ideas, and arguments in the history of philosophy. Philbits is brought to you by philosophy2u.com. My name is Dr. Todd May, and in this episode, we'll be exploring the question, what is hermeneutics? It's the first of two episodes aimed at introducing the fascinating branch of philosophy called hermeneutics to students and professionals interested in storytelling, interpretation of contexts, and the application of meaning to life. So let's get started. The word hermeneutics derives from the ancient Greek, and you may recognize its roots if you're familiar with ancient Greek mythology. The messenger of the gods is Hermes, and hermeneutics can be seen in a general sense as a form of critical reflection interested in how to understand messages that are spoken, written, and unspoken or unwritten, yet visual, as in symbols. Why is this focus of hermeneutics important? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you understood what someone was saying, but then got it entirely wrong? It's the basis for a lot of situational comedy on television. Consider this historical instance. During the mid-12th century, the King Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, had a disagreement about the primacy of power. Should it be the state government that the king represented and headed, or the divine church? Becket's refusal to acquiesce to Henry and his attempt to excommunicate the king eventually led to Henry II's well-known utterance, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" What should we make of the utterance? Hermeneutically speaking, is it a command or a question expressing a grievance? And what should we make of the knights who took the utterance as a command to assassinate Thomas Becket? Historically, legally, and morally, the range of hermeneutical interpretations of the utterance are intriguing. Now let's look at other instances, ones that are potentially controversial and complex. What about texts that have to do with the way we should act? For example, government texts like the US Constitution, or religious texts that have a say on what moral conduct is. Let's take the example of the book of Genesis from the Bible. We're all familiar with the episode that's known as the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve eat the apple and they're expelled from the garden. There are at least two competing interpretations of that episode, each with different and hugely significant consequences in how we understand what it means to act morally and in this life. Let's have a closer look. It was the most evil of times. It was the most innocent of times. The place was the Garden of Eden. Typically, the Garden of Eden episode is taken to account for how our human nature is corrupted by temptation. Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of which God forbade, and the act leads to their expulsion. We tend to refer to this episode as the fall, as in the fall from some kind of grace or perfection. And we think about the temptation and the serpent as the temptation of the devil. So if you look at the image on the right side of the slide, you'll see the representation of the serpent in the guise of the devil. Whereas in contrast, the image on the left side doesn't have those kinds of connotations. So in a sense, the two slides represent the two ways in which we might interpret the Garden of Eden. If we read the Garden of Eden in terms of our moral imperfection and our moral corruption, we can refer to that as the moral reading of the Garden of Eden. But let's examine the second one. First, let us consider the passages from the episode of the Garden of Eden. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not certainly die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it." We typically want to blame the serpent, but if we look closely at the text, the serpent is merely reporting what is true and not true of the fruit. If anyone comes off as being questionable, it's the character of God who has told a lie, or at the very least a noble lie, to Adam and Eve to prevent them from gaining wisdom. But isn't wisdom a good thing? On the moral reading of the episode, God seems to come off as an overprotective parent who deprives Adam and Eve of an essential capacity to think. The moral reading seems questionable at best. Well, if the moral interpretation seems inconsistent and a bit tenuous with respect to credibility, then what are we to make of how gaining wisdom results in some kind of departure or expulsion? What can we make on a second interpretation of the episode? Well, we might read the garden as representing an ideal state of innocence in which knowledge of distinctions, like good and evil, is absent. So knowing these distinctions involves no longer being innocent. And one may gain in understanding things like concepts, relations, and processes, but by this knowing, one also recognizes how separate one is from nature. One has to cope with and overcome those things that define the human condition. Things like toil, vulnerability, sorrow, hope, mortality, and giving birth. The upshot, instead of a moral meaning, the Garden of Eden metaphorically describes the human condition, one in which we have a knowledge of distinctions, yet one of those distinctions involves our own human condition of effort, resistance, and desire. Paul Ricoeur, a hermeneutical philosopher whom we'll discuss in the next episode, therefore referred to such a way of interpreting passages like the Garden of Eden as an existential or ontological one. That is, they reveal something about the nature of our existence or our manner of being in the world. So I've used the Garden of Eden episode to help demonstrate the ways in which we can interpret episodes or texts differently. Now, it opens the door to a lot of questions, or perhaps it opens a can of worms. To be sure, we can ask questions about where does literal meaning fall in? What about authorial intention? And does a text like Genesis or the Garden of Eden have an original historical meaning? These are huge questions and huge debates which I don't have time to answer in this episode, but please look at the YouTube comment for further suggestions that address these kinds of questions. In the next episode, we're going to learn how the 20th century gave rise to something called philosophical hermeneutics, where the concern is not just about interpreting text and speech, but how interpretation applies to life as a whole. We're not just the thinking, political, speaking being, we're also the interpreting being. But for now, I just want to end by highlighting a few bullet points about how hermeneutics is not just an academic concern, but applies more broadly to other aspects of life, both professional and practical. The first is application. Hermeneutics helps to cultivate an awareness of what might be relevant in trying to understand what the meaning of a text is. And this is very important for legal and historical documents, which often act as an authority on our own conduct. The second is listening and storytelling. Hermeneutics helps to cultivate the ability to listen to others and to help understand and decipher what's going on in a story. Knowing that there are various factors contextualizing meaning, as we saw in the Garden of Eden example, or knowing that there are multiple interpretations that might arise with respect to an utterance, as we saw in the Henry II example. It also helps us to be attentive to recognize how people tell their own stories and how these stories might take a different form or use different words or phrases. And so it cultivates a sensitivity and a kind of linguistic hospitality in relation to others. The final point is argumentation and justification. Because hermeneutics is interested in offering different interpretations, we often find one interpretation more plausible or credible than another. To make that case, we have to engage in a process of arguing why that interpretation is more relevant, as I tried to do so with respect to the ontological existential understanding of the episode of the Garden of Eden. And then we have to justify it, so we have to provide reasons why our interpretation might be more credible than a competitor. So all these, application, listening and storytelling, and argumentation and justification, are what philosophers like to call virtues about reasoning. So hermeneutics plays a key role in our ability to be able to analyze, understand, and communicate with others. That's all the time we have for this episode. I hope you found this foray into the question, what is hermeneutics, interesting and fascinating. As I said, next week we'll look at philosophical hermeneutics, where we'll get a bit more philosophical detail and questions and applications about how hermeneutics can transform the way in which we think about our lives and our relation to others. That's it for now. My name is Dr. Todd May, and this has been PhilBits, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.